Hey guys, tonight we are opening a locked room inside the Kennedy family. For decades, America saw the Kennedy family as a perfect photograph. Handsome sons, polished daughters, sailboats, campaigns, funerals, flags. But one daughter kept disappearing from the frame. Her name was Rosemary Kennedy, and when history finally looked closer, it did not find a scandal. It found a woman who had been alive, conscious, feeling, and present while the world was taught not to ask where she had gone. This is the story of how one surgical procedure changed a young woman's life without ending it. How a powerful family protected its image by controlling what the public was allowed to know. And how the nation that worshipped the Kennedys rarely stopped to ask why one daughter had vanished from the story. The truth is worse than the silence. Because Rosemary Kennedy could read, she could write, she could dance, attend mass, keep a diary. She presented at Buckingham Palace in front of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth in 1938, wearing a white court gown and long gloves, and she made it through one of the most formal, terrifying public moments of her young life. She was 19 years old then, and by many accounts, she was beautiful. 3 years later, doctors performed a frontal lobotomy while she was awake, asking her to speak as they cut deeper into the connections of her brain. By the time the procedure was over, Rosemary Kennedy could no longer walk the way she had walked, speak the way she had spoken, or return to the life she had been trying so hard to live. Her father arranged it. Her mother was not told until afterward. The rest of the Kennedy family learned the truth in pieces over years, and some of them never forgave Joseph Kennedy for what he did. Before we go further, remember this: Rosemary Kennedy was not a rumor inside a famous family. She was a daughter. If stories like hers matter to you, stay with me and subscribe, because this channel is built for histories that powerful people hoped would stay quiet. Now, let us go back to the beginning, not to the operation, not to the moment the decision was made, but to the daughter herself, before anyone decided she was a problem that needed solving. September 13th, 1918. Brookline, Massachusetts. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy went into labor at home. The doctor was delayed. He was treating patients in the influenza pandemic that was killing Americans by the thousands that fall. The nurse who attended Rose was alone, and when the baby began to crown, the nurse made a decision that would define an entire life. The nurse told Rose Kennedy to hold the baby back. The nurse was waiting for the doctor. Later accounts claim she did not want to deliver the baby herself because the doctor would not receive his fee if he was not present. According to later biographical accounts, Rosemary was kept in the birth canal for nearly 2 hours while everyone waited for the doctor. If that account is accurate, those 2 hours may have deprived her brain of the oxygen it needed most. When the doctor finally arrived and Rosemary was born, she looked healthy. 10 fingers, 10 toes. She cried. She breathed. She nursed. The family was told everything was fine. But the family could not yet know what those hours may have cost. Later biographical accounts and modern medical interpretation point toward oxygen deprivation as a likely contributor to Rosemary's developmental challenges. The public record cannot prove the exact cause with certainty. What it can show is what came next. Rosemary developed more slowly than her brothers, and the difference became harder to ignore. The Kennedys were not a family that expected obstacles. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy were Boston Irish Catholic aristocracy, wealthy, socially connected, and ferociously ambitious. Joseph had made his fortune through banking, Wall Street, Hollywood, and liquor after Prohibition ended, while rumors about Prohibition followed him for the rest of his life. Rose came from political royalty. Her father, John Honey Fitzgerald, had been the mayor of Boston. Their children were being groomed for greatness from birth. Joseph Jr., the eldest, was destined to be president. John, the second son, was charming and sharp. And now Rosemary, the first daughter. At first, the differences were easy to miss. Rosemary was slower to crawl than her brothers, slower to walk, slower to form words. But babies develop at their own pace, the family reasoned. There was no cause for alarm, except the delays did not resolve. They deepened. By the time Rosemary was 5, it was clear something was different. She struggled to keep up with her younger siblings. Her handwriting was shaky, uneven. Letters formed with effort, words misspelled. Her reading lagged years behind. Simple arithmetic confused her, and yet, Rosemary was affectionate, warm, socially engaged. She loved her family deeply and wanted desperately to please them. She tried so hard. In photographs from her childhood, you can see it. The way she leans into her mother, the way she smiles at her brothers. She wanted to belong. She wanted to be like them. But the Kennedy family culture rewarded speed, polish, confidence, and victory, the very things Rosemary had to work hardest to imitate. Joseph Kennedy Sr. ran his household like a boot camp. Winning was everything. Coming in second was failure. The children were pushed, tested, measured against one another constantly. Dinner table conversations were debates, sports were battles. Academic achievement was non-negotiable. The family motto might as well have been, "Kennedys do not lose." Rosemary was measured every day against a standard that had never been built for her. Not because she did not try, not because she lacked character or love or effort, but because her brain worked differently, and the world she had been born into had no patience for difference. In the Kennedy household, love often arrived as correction. Between 1924 and 1938, Rosemary Kennedy was enrolled in a series of private schools. Some were gentle, patient, staffed by nuns who understood that not every child learned the same way. Others were rigorous, demanding, designed to push her toward normalcy through sheer force of repetition. Joseph Kennedy Sr. wrote letters to her teachers constantly, long, detailed instructions about her routines, her diet, her schedule. He wanted progress reports. He wanted measurable improvement. He wanted proof that enough discipline, enough structure, and enough money could close the distance between Rosemary and the rest of the family. And for a time, it seemed like it might be working. At Devereux Schools in Pennsylvania, a progressive institution that specialized in children with learning differences, Rosemary made real progress. She learned to read, slowly, haltingly, but she learned. She could write letters home, and those letters survive today in the archives of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. They are not polished, the spelling is inconsistent, the grammar is simple, but they are hers, her handwriting, her words, her voice. Dear Daddy, I hope you are well. I am learning to sew. The sisters are very kind. I miss you. Love, Rosemary. That is one example. There are dozens more. Letters to her mother, letters to her siblings, notes about dances she attended, friends she made, classes she took. These letters prove something crucial. Rosemary Kennedy's life cannot be reduced to a diagnosis. She had limitations, yes. She needed structure, patience, individualized support. But she could function with support. She could read and write in her own way. She was fully human. And yet, after the disaster, the public story around Rosemary often made her sound smaller than these letters suggest. The letters complicate that story. They show limitation, yes, but they also show memory, feeling, longing, effort, and a voice of her own. But here's the thing about having a daughter who can almost keep up, almost fit in, almost pass. It creates a different kind of pressure. Because if Rosemary had been profoundly disabled from birth, the family might have accepted it, institutionalized her early, moved on. But Rosemary was close enough to normal that her parents kept believing she could be brought the rest of the way. And when that did not happen, the frustration on both sides grew unbearable. To Joseph Kennedy, Rosemary became a problem he believed could be managed. To Rosemary, the family she loved became a room where effort was never quite enough. And then came London. In 1938, Joseph Kennedy Sr. was appointed United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James, the formal title for the American ambassador to Great Britain. It was the pinnacle of his public career. And it meant the entire Kennedy family would move to London. Rosemary was 19 years old. The move could have been a disaster. London society was formal, hierarchical, unforgiving. The social rituals of the British aristocracy were Byzantine. Who sat where at dinner, how deep to curtsy, which fork to use, which titles required which forms of address. One mistake could humiliate the family. And Rosemary, who struggled with pressure and complicated instructions, entered that world carrying more risk than anyone around her wanted to admit. Except for a brief and remarkable time, she was not the disaster they feared. In London, Rosemary came closer than she ever had to being seen as more than a family problem. She was enrolled at the Assumption Convent School in Kensington Square, run by the Religious of the Assumption, an order of Catholic nuns. The school used a Montessori-based approach, individualized, patient, focused on building confidence rather than demanding conformity. The nuns loved her. They reported that she was sweet, attentive, eager to learn. She made friends. She took art classes. She learned new skills. For the first time in her life, Rosemary was in an environment that did not see her as broken. And for a moment, the daughter they had spent years correcting began to look less like a failure and more like a young woman finally placed in the right light. The photographs from this period are stunning. Rosemary Kennedy, in her late teens and early 20s, was genuinely beautiful. Dark hair, bright eyes, a warm smile. She looked like her mother. She looked like a Kennedy. And when she was presented at Buckingham Palace in May 1938, alongside her mother Rose and her sister Kathleen, she did not embarrass anyone. The presentation at court was one of the most formal, high-pressure, social events in British aristocratic life. Young women from prominent families were introduced to the king and queen in a choreographed ceremony that required perfect posture, perfect timing, perfect decorum. One stumble, one wrong move, and the gossip would follow you for years. Rosemary Kennedy walked across the floor in her white court gown, long white gloves reaching past her elbows, a small tiara in her hair. She curtsied to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Whether every movement was perfect or not, she made it through. In that room, under that pressure, Rosemary did what everyone had feared she could not do, and the newspapers took her photograph. There she is, Rosemary Kennedy, daughter of the American ambassador, standing beside her mother and sister at Buckingham Palace. Smiling, present, alive. She attended dances. She went to the theater. She socialized with other young women her age. She had, by all accounts, the best 2 years of her life. But beneath the surface, Joseph Kennedy was worried. Because Rosemary was no longer a child. And in the 1930s, a young woman with intellectual limitations was often treated less as a person with needs than as a threat to family reputation. They were seen as sexually vulnerable, easily manipulated, prone to pregnancies out of wedlock, likely to bring shame on their families. And Joseph Kennedy Sr. was a man whose entire identity was built on control. Control of his fortune, control of his political ambitions, control of his family's public image. The idea that Rosemary might enter a world he could not fully supervise, romance, sexuality, manipulation, scandal, terrified him. So, when the war came and the family had to return to the United States, Joseph Kennedy made sure Rosemary came too. And that is when everything began to fall apart. In 1940, the Kennedy family left London and returned to the United States. Joseph Kennedy's tenure as ambassador had ended under a cloud. His views on Britain, Germany, and the war had made him politically toxic at home. His dream of a cabinet position, maybe even the presidency, was dead. His sons would have to carry that dream forward now. Rosemary was sent to a Catholic convent school in Washington, D.C. The nuns reported that she was cooperative, kind, and making progress. But Rosemary herself was struggling. She was 22 years old, and for the first time in her life, she understood, really understood, that she was different. That her siblings were moving forward into careers, marriages, adulthood, and she was being left behind. She grew frustrated, restless, moody. Later accounts, disputed, filtered through family memory, and difficult to verify, claimed that Rosemary began leaving the school at night, wandering beyond supervision, and frightening the people responsible for protecting the Kennedy name. Whether those reports were accurate or exaggerated, we do not know. What we do know is that Joseph Kennedy believed them, and he believed Rosemary was a risk to herself, to the family, to his sons' political futures. So, he went looking for a solution, and he found one. A doctor named Walter Freeman had a new procedure that promised to calm difficult patients, to eliminate aggression, anxiety, emotional outbursts, to make people manageable. The word sounded clinical, almost clean. Lobotomy. To the doctors, it was a modern procedure. To Joseph Kennedy, it looked like a solution. But to Rosemary, it would become the line between the life she had been fighting to keep and the decades of silence that came after. And Joseph Kennedy decided that Rosemary, his first daughter, the girl whose handwriting still waited in the archives, needed one. The strangest thing about what Joseph Kennedy did in 1941 is not the decision itself. It is how reasonable it probably felt to him when he made it. This is not a defense. It is something more uncomfortable than that. Because to understand how a father could authorize irreversible surgery on his 23-year-old daughter without telling his wife, without telling Rosemary what was going to happen to her, without leaving behind any clear public record that Rosemary herself had been meaningfully consulted. You have to understand that in 1941, no one stopped him, not the medical system around him, not the family structure above Rosemary, not the doctors who believed they were offering a cure. Nobody asked if she had been consulted. The concept barely existed yet. Joseph Kennedy had spent the months after the family's return from London building a wall between what Rosemary was and what he needed her not to become. The specific reports he received about her behavior at St. Gertrude's in Washington, late-night departures from the school grounds, emotional volatility, what biographers describe as episodes the sisters found increasingly difficult to manage, remain partially undisclosed in the historical record. What we do know, as documented in Kate Clifford Larson's 2015 biography, Rosemary, the hidden Kennedy daughter, is that Joseph interpreted those reports through the lens of a man who had spent 20 years managing his daughter's difference as a reputation risk, and who now saw that risk accelerating towards something he could not contain. She was 23. She was not a child he could redirect with a new school. She was a young woman with a social life, with desires, with moods she could not always control. And Joseph Kennedy understood that the world his sons were about to enter had no room for that kind of exposure. Joseph Jr. was being positioned for political life. John was sharpening into something formidable. The family's name was a brand, and its value depended on consistency. A daughter who wandered after dark was not a manageable variable. What Joseph needed was a word that sounded like medicine, and in 1941, he found one. Walter Freeman was not a fringe figure. That is what makes this story colder. He was the head of the neurology department at George Washington University, credentialed, published, confident, and, by the standards of his era, mainstream. He had been performing prefrontal lobotomies in the United States since 1936, when Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz first published the procedure's results, and the American medical establishment received them with something close to excitement. Freeman believed, genuinely believed, with the missionary certainty of a man who had never been seriously challenged, that severing the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain could relieve suffering, could calm what no drug had yet calmed, could return a difficult patient to a manageable life. His surgical partner was James Watts, a neurosurgeon. A year later, in 1942, they would publish Psychosurgery, one of the foundational American texts that tried to turn this procedure into respectable medicine. In the year before Rosemary's operation, they had already performed the surgery on dozens of patients. The procedure they used on Rosemary was the standard Freeman-Watts technique of that period, with local anesthetic and mild sedation, enough to keep her awake and responsive, but not enough to protect her from what was being taken. Surgeons drilled 2 small holes on either side of the skull above the frontal lobes. A thin spatula-like instrument was then inserted through those openings and swept back and forth, severing the white matter tracts that connected the prefrontal cortex to the thalamus. The theory was that these connections were responsible for the emotional distress that made patients difficult. Cut them, and the distress would be quiet. The evidence base for this theory was anecdotal. Confidence arrived before proof. There were no controlled trials. There was no systematic follow-up. There were no ethics committees reviewing cases. The modern language of informed consent did not exist in American medicine the way it does now. The Nuremberg Code would not arrive until 1947, and the legal doctrine Americans now associate with informed consent would develop more clearly in the decades after Rosemary's operation. A father's permission was sufficient. That sentence should feel impossible. In 1941, it did not, and Joseph Kennedy gave it. What no one asked was whether Rosemary had given hers. Rose Kennedy was not in that conversation. This is documented. According to accounts compiled by Larson and Lemur, Rose Kennedy was not informed of the operation before it was performed. She was not asked. She was not consulted. The woman who had raised Rosemary, who had written to her teachers, who had organized her routines and advocated for her education for 2 decades, she was excluded from the most consequential decision ever made about her daughter's mind. Later, in her 1974 autobiography, Times to Remember, Rose Kennedy discussed Rosemary's condition and institutionalization with a restraint that has frustrated historians ever since. The precise moment she was told, what she was told, and how fully she understood the nature of the procedure. These things remain genuinely unclear from the historical record. What biographers have noted is that when she did learn, the marriage that had already been strained by decades of Joseph's absences and infidelities absorbed this too. What Rose Kennedy felt privately is not something the surviving record can answer with certainty. What it can say is that she was not in the room, and nobody thought to put her there. As for the children, the brothers, the sisters who had grown up alongside Rosemary, the historical record on what they knew and when is complicated and thin. The family's internal communications about lobotomy were not widely preserved or disclosed. What biographers note is that some of Rosemary's siblings, including Eunice, were apparently not given accurate information about what had happened for years. The silence was not uniform across the family. It was staggered, partial, and controlled by Joseph in the same way he controlled everything else. He told people what he decided they needed to know. He had always operated this way. The lobotomy was not a departure from his character. It was its purest expression. The operation took place in November 1941 at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. The exact date has not been definitively established in the public record. What has been established, primarily through James Watts's own later account, is what happened inside that room. Rosemary was kept conscious throughout. This was not unusual for the Freeman-Watts technique. Keeping the patient awake and responsive was actually central to the procedure's method. As the surgeons worked, they asked her to speak, to count, to recite prayers she had learned as a child, to sing. Each verbal response gave them a gauge, a living, real-time indicator of what the severing was doing as they went deeper. When her words remained coherent, the procedure continued. When her responses began to blur and fragment, the doctors knew they had reached the point of effect. The cruelty is in the method. The girl who had learned to write her own letters, halting, misspelled, honest, hers, was now in a surgical chair, being asked to produce language, while doctors measured how much of that language remained as they cut further into the tissue that generated it. Her voice was not being listened to. It was being monitored. The moment it changed enough, the work was done. James Watts later described the procedure in interviews. He said that, as they continued, Rosemary became more difficult to understand. The words came slower, more confused. He noted it with clinical detachment. That change in her speech was the marker they were using. It told them they had gone far enough. They stopped. But stopping was not the same as saving her. She did not recover in the days that followed, not in the way they had promised. The operation was meant to reduce agitation, to quiet the behaviors Joseph feared. Instead, according to Larson's account, it produced something no one in that room seemed to have fully anticipated, or fully admitted to anticipating. The Rosemary who had walked out of St. Gertrude's and into that hospital was gone. The woman who emerged from the procedure could no longer speak in connected sentences. She could not care for herself. One side of her body was affected. She had difficulty with an arm and leg, and her mobility was permanently altered, a result that Watts later acknowledged. The intellectual functioning she had spent years building, reinforced through patience and structure and her own stubborn effort, had been severely regressed. Before the operation, she had been moving forward, slowly, unevenly, but forward. After it, even crossing a room became part of what had been taken. Joseph Kennedy had wanted her calmed. What he produced was devastation. There is no documented record that he acknowledged this directly, at least not in any form that has survived or been disclosed to historians. No letter, no account from family members describing his remorse in those first weeks. What the record does show is that he moved with the same decisiveness in the aftermath that he had used to arrange the surgery. Rosemary was placed in private care, initially at Craig House, a private psychiatric hospital in Beacon, New York. The name of the facility is documented. What remains thin in the public record is the day-to-day texture of those years who visited, what Rosemary experienced there, and how much the family truly understood. Larson and other biographers note the gap plainly. The specific facilities, conditions, and circumstances of Rosemary's life during that period are not fully documented in publicly available sources. The family's wealth ensured private care, but it also ensured privacy, a word that, in this context, had another meaning entirely. The public story? There was none, not yet, no announcement, no explanation. The Kennedy family continued appearing at events, continued generating press, continued building the infrastructure of a political dynasty, and Rosemary, who had been publicly photographed in London, who had attended theater and dances, who had been written about as one of Ambassador Kennedy's beautiful daughters, simply stopped appearing. No one in the family commented on it publicly. And if reporters noticed the absence, they did not force the question into the center of the Kennedy story. The authority Joseph Kennedy had used to arrange the surgery now shaped the silence around it. His signature had authorized the operation. His authority now sealed the record. Both moves, the decision and the concealment, came from the same source, the belief that he had the right to decide what happened to his daughter and what the world was allowed to know about it. The word consent never appears in the story of what happened to Rosemary Kennedy in 1941. Not from the doctors, not from the law, not from the father who arranged it, because no one in that chain of authority thought to ask her. And here is the thing that the family would not face for years, that the historical record makes undeniable. The operation did not solve anything. It did not protect the political careers. It did not reduce the family's exposure. It did not make Joseph Kennedy's life easier or cleaner or safer from the kind of scrutiny he feared. It made Rosemary's objection impossible for anyone to hear. She was now dependent. She required total care. She could not leave on her own. She could not speak to a reporter. She could not embarrass anyone at a fundraiser or slip away from a school. She was manageable in the most terrible interpretation of that word, not because she had been healed, but because she had been reduced. The problem Joseph Kennedy had tried to eliminate had been replaced by a situation far worse and far more permanent. And now he had to decide what to do with her. The answer he chose would not be announced. It would not be explained. It would simply happen, quietly, in the way that powerful families make certain things happen, through money, through access, through the ability to place a person somewhere and trust that the world will not ask too many questions about where she went. Somewhere in the early 1940s, the name Rosemary Kennedy began to disappear from the Kennedy family's public story. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way a photograph fades, so slowly that you almost don't notice until you look at the space where she used to be. The family had other things to manage: a war, careers, a dynasty to build, and one daughter, somewhere in a private facility in New York, for whom none of that was possible anymore. The silence was about to become official. The surgery was over. but it had not solved anything Joseph Kennedy thought it would solve. That is the part no one was supposed to know. The silence was just beginning. Here is what people often miss about what happened to Rosemary Kennedy in the weeks after the operation. There was no announcement, no public illness, no polite press release about a daughter who needed rest. The Kennedys did not explain her disappearance because they were never asked to. She simply stopped appearing. And in a world moving at wartime speed, the absence of one woman, even an ambassador's daughter, could dissolve into the noise without a sound. That is how it began. Not with a lie told loudly, with a conversation that never happened. The months that followed the operation existed almost entirely outside the public record. And history, in that moment, gave Joseph Kennedy something he could not have arranged himself. December 7th, 1941. Less than a month after the operation, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the Second World War. The country's grief and urgency consumed the national conversation entirely. Families across America were separating, relocating, going silent. Sons were enlisting. Daughters were leaving home to work in factories. People were moving, disappearing, reappearing in uniform. In that context, the sudden absence of one Kennedy daughter from family photographs did not raise any eyebrows that stayed raised. Wartime normalized a particular kind of vanishing. Joseph Kennedy understood timing. He always had. It is worth sitting with that coincidence, or that convenience, for a moment. The operation happened in autumn 1941. Pearl Harbor was December 7th. Within weeks of a procedure that permanently changed his daughter's life, history gave the country something enormous to look at. A nation at war had little attention left for the private absence of a former ambassador's daughter. The public record for Rosemary simply goes quiet. Powerful families do not always need to lie loudly. So how does a story disappear? Not by being denied, by never being given a language in the first place. They do not need to gather in a room and draft a statement. They do not need to threaten anyone or fabricate documents. What they need, and what the Kennedys had in abundance, is the ability to simply not answer certain questions, to let a polite vagueness settle over a topic until it calcifies into family history. If someone in those years had asked about Rosemary, a journalist, a neighbor, a distant family friend, the answer was probably some version of "she is not well, she is being cared for, she needs privacy, it is a family matter." Not a single word of that is a direct lie. Every word of it, arranged that way, is a wall. The family's Catholic faith provided additional insulation. In the tight-knit world of prominent American Catholic families in the 1940s, a certain deference existed around private suffering. You did not press. You offered your prayers and you changed the subject. That cultural reflex, respect cloaked as discretion, made Rosemary's absence easier to maintain. The same community that might have asked questions instead offered condolences for an unspecified difficulty, and then let it go. The omission was repeated until it became family history. And family history, once settled, is very hard to dislodge. While Rosemary was in private care, somewhere between a New York facility and a life that no longer resembled the one she had known, the rest of the Kennedy family was becoming the Kennedy family. Joseph Jr. was flying combat missions over Europe. John Jack was a naval officer in the Pacific, commanding PT-109, and would be celebrated as a war hero after its sinking in August 1943. Kathleen, the second daughter, was working in London with the Red Cross and would marry the Marquis of Hartington in 1944, placing a Kennedy girl into the British aristocracy. Every year the Kennedy name grew louder. Rosemary's life grew quieter. This is not a coincidence. The family's public mythology was being built in real time. War service, sacrifice, glamour, tragedy, and the foundation of that mythology was a story of a family that moved forward, that bore loss with grace, that never stopped. A daughter in private care, requiring total assistance, unable to speak clearly, or dress herself, or write the letters she once wrote. That daughter did not fit the myth being constructed. Not because anyone made a formal decision to exclude her, but because the story being told had a particular shape, and she no longer fit inside it. The photograph of the Kennedy family, taken year after year through the 1940s and early 1950s, has a gap in it. You have to know to look for it. Most people did not know to look. The record of what she had lost was already written. What had not been written yet was what that loss would become inside the Kennedy story. A medical disaster became a family arrangement. A daughter became a private matter. A life that had once required patience now required paperwork, distance, money, and people willing not to ask too much. That was the next injury, not the operation itself. What came after it? Between 1941 and 1949, the publicly available record of Rosemary's care is thin. Larson's biography documents the New York placement, but notes that the details of those years are not fully confirmed in accessible sources. What is documented is what happened in 1949. Rosemary Kennedy was transferred to St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin. The school was run by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi, a Catholic religious order. It would remain her home for the rest of her life. Rosemary died on January 7, 2005, at age 86, at Fort Atkinson Memorial Hospital in Wisconsin, after a life spent mostly under the care system built around St. Coletta, Jefferson, Wisconsin. The name alone tells you something about the distance involved. Not just the miles between Eastern family wealth and the Midwestern prairie, but the conceptual distance. The Kennedy world operated on the coasts. It operated in drawing rooms and Senate chambers and sailboat races off Hyannisport. Jefferson, Wisconsin, was another country. The Kennedys had mastered public life. Rosemary was now being moved into private life so completely it almost became another country. St. Coletta was not an asylum. That distinction matters. It was a Catholic care facility that served people with intellectual disabilities. The nuns there were, by later accounts, genuinely devoted to the people in their care. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, in later years, described Rosemary as well cared for and, in her understanding, content. But St. Coletta was also far away, far from Hyannisport, far from Palm Beach, far from the rooms where family photographs were taken, and the Kennedy legend was assembled piece by piece. In this family, distance did a great deal of work. There is another way to read what happened to Rosemary Kennedy that goes beyond any one decision, any one man, any one operation. Think of her life as a ledger. On one side, everything she had managed to build slowly against a standard that had never been designed for her. On the other, speech, mobility, independence, choice, the ordinary freedoms the operation narrowed in a single morning. For the next 2 decades, the Kennedy family did not falsify that ledger. They closed it, placed it in a drawer, and built a public story around the empty space. That, who she actually was, underneath everything the family built over her, and the movement built around her, and the historical record built in spite of her, is the place the final chapter has to go. What the world believed was that she had simply faded. A Kennedy daughter who had never quite kept up, who had retreated quietly into illness, as sometimes happened. People filled in the rest with whatever made them comfortable, and the family allowed that filling in to continue. That is how silence becomes biography. While the family's silence held through the 1940s and into the 1950s, one of Rosemary's sisters was watching. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, the fifth child, not quite 3 years younger than Rosemary, had grown up alongside her. She knew the letters. She knew the sister who danced and laughed and tried. She knew what Rosemary had been before, and she understood, in a way that the public record does not fully capture, what had been lost. One sister was still paying attention. What she would build from that attention, and what it cost the woman it was built around, is where the story moves next. Rosemary had been removed from the Kennedy story. But one sister would eventually look at that absence and see not shame, but a mission. And what she built from it would reach further than any of them could have imagined, from a Maryland lawn in 1962, with swimsuits, volunteers, guest lists, and lemonade waiting for children the country had barely learned how to welcome. The silence was not the end of Rosemary's story, not even close. Grief does not always announce itself. Sometimes it gets up in the morning, makes coffee, and goes to work. That is approximately what Eunice Kennedy Shriver did for years. She did not speak publicly about Rosemary for a long time after the operation. She did not organize a press conference or write a letter to the editor. She did not stand on a Capitol Hill staircase and testify about what her family had done. She was a Kennedy, which meant she was trained from childhood to move forward, to project strength, to treat visible vulnerability as a kind of defeat. She had absorbed those lessons as thoroughly as any of her siblings. But she had also grown up in the same house as Rosemary. And that is where this chapter really begins. Before the operation, before the years in New York, before Wisconsin, and before any of that, Eunice and Rosemary were just sisters. Close enough in age that childhood was shared territory, the same Saturday routines, the same dinner table competitions, the same summers at Hyannis Port where the ocean came right up to the grass. Eunice was sharp, competitive, and driven in a way that fit the Kennedy mold almost perfectly. Rosemary was warmer, slower, more easily overwhelmed. They were not the same kind of person, but they were close. People who study this family closely point to something most of the public image never captured. Eunice paid attention to Rosemary in a way the brothers did not or could not. She had watched her sister try. She had seen the effort behind the letters, the practicing, the determination not to fall too far behind. She understood, at a more personal level than analysis allows, what Rosemary's reaching for things looked like from the inside of a family. When the operation happened in 1941, Eunice was 20 years old. She was not told the full truth right away. The historical record on exactly what Eunice knew and when is incomplete, in the careful way that records involving this family tend to be incomplete. Biographers, including Kate Clifford Larson, note that the siblings received information about Rosemary in fragments, partial accounts shaped by what Joseph Kennedy decided to disclose and when. Eunice almost certainly understood that something had gone terribly wrong. She may not have understood for years precisely what had been done and why. That gap between what she suspected and what she was allowed to know is not a small thing. What fills a gap like that in a person with Eunice's constitution is not nothing. It is something. It moves around inside, looking for a shape. For most of the 1940s, the country was busy. And in the middle of a nation's busyness, certain kinds of suffering are not invisible exactly. They are just not worth the disruption of asking about directly. People with intellectual disabilities in mid-century America occupied a particular kind of social space. They existed, in large numbers, in every town and every family. But the public conversation around them was almost entirely shaped by what was easier for everyone else. Families were often told by doctors, neighbors, and clergy alike that a child with significant intellectual limitations was better off in an institution. Better for the child, so the reasoning went, to be around others like themselves. Better for the family to be free of the strain. The language used for people with intellectual disabilities in this era matters, and it is worth naming directly. Federal and state systems used words like mental deficiency. Medical books used categories that sound cruel now, but carried real authority then. The cruelty was not always shouted. Often, it was typed neatly onto official forms. These were not slurs spoken in the street. They were official medical categories, printed in diagnostic manuals, cited in court cases, used to justify sterilization laws that were upheld by the United States Supreme Court as recently as 1927 in Buck v. Bell. That ruling had not been overturned by 1950. Families that kept a child with intellectual disabilities at home often did so in near total private. Neighbors knew not to ask. Social invitations quietly stopped arriving. In polite company, the subject changed the way subjects do when everyone in the room has agreed, without speaking, that certain things do not get discussed at the table. The shame was not always cruel in its intent. Sometimes it was just the shape that discomfort takes when society has no better vocabulary for difference. The country had institutions. What it did not have was imagination. Large state-run facilities existed in almost every state by mid-century, some of them housing thousands of people at once. Years later, New York's Willowbrook State School would become a national symbol of institutional neglect after public investigations and televised reporting exposed conditions that many families had never been allowed to see. But in the 1950s, the overcrowding, the understaffing, and the warehouse logic of many large institutions were already known to people who worked close enough to smell the problem. Most families had no Kennedy-level resources. Most families could not arrange a private cottage with dedicated sisters and structured routines. Most families were choosing between a child at home with no public support or a state institution with minimal oversight and often genuinely terrible conditions. The choice, as it was presented to most American families in the 1940s and 1950s, was not a real choice at all. It was just a different shape of disappearance. Eunice Kennedy Shriver was watching all of this. Not from the outside, the way a policy researcher watches a problem. From the inside, the way a sister watches a system that consumed someone she loved. She had become, by the early 1950s, a force of nature in the Kennedy mold. Educated, connected, ambitious, and married to Sergeant Shriver, a man who matched her energy and shared her sense that the world could be organized differently if someone with enough determination got hold of it. She worked. She advocated. She had 5 children. She moved in the political circles that her brothers were making famous. But she kept coming back to Rosemary. Not publicly, not yet. But the question that Rosemary's life posed, what does a society owe the people it finds inconvenient to see, was something Eunice carried in her without being able to fully set it down. By 1961, John Kennedy was in the White House. The family name was at its most luminous, and Eunice used that proximity to power for something most people in her position would never have considered. She pushed her brother, the President of the United States. to make intellectual disability a federal priority. In October 1961, President Kennedy established the President's Panel on Mental Retardation, a national commission charged with examining the condition of people with intellectual disabilities in America and recommending federal action. Eunice was instrumental in its creation. The panel issued its report in 1962, and it was direct. The country's treatment of people with intellectual disabilities was inadequate, underfunded, and often actively harmful. It called for new research, new institutions designed differently, new community-based support. This was not an accident of the Kennedy agenda. This was Eunice pulling a door open from the inside. But Eunice did not begin with legislation. She began with a lawn. In the summer of 1962, she converted the grounds of Timberlawn, the Rockville, Maryland estate where the Shrivers were living, into a summer day camp for children with intellectual disabilities. Children came from local families and institutions. Some arrived with parents who had never before been invited to bring them somewhere public. Some arrived from places where the idea of organized recreation barely existed. Think about what a morning looked like there. Summer heat, the smell of cut grass and sunscreen, children arriving in cars, some of them quiet, some of them loud, some of them terrified, some of them just glad to be somewhere new. Volunteers, college students, some of them Kennedy family friends, some of them recruited through local organizations, waiting by the swimming pool and the athletic fields. Eunice herself moving through it all, stopping to talk to a child, adjusting a schedule, barking instructions at a counselor who wasn't paying attention. There was swimming. There was track. There was basketball and volleyball. There were games with no complicated rules. There was lemonade. There was applause, specific, directed, real applause, for children who crossed a finish line or caught a ball or simply made it across the pool and back. The parents who stood at the edge of that lawn watching their children compete, laugh, fall down, and get back up. Some of them had not seen their child publicly celebrated for anything, not once. That is not a small thing. Eunice did not announce, in the summer of 1962, that any of this was connected to her sister in Wisconsin. She did not stand up before the children and deliver a speech about family guilt or hidden histories. She just opened her property. She just started. Rosemary was not the only reason Eunice cared. She had worked in juvenile justice, in poverty, in policy. She understood deprivation from more than one angle. But she was the reason Eunice could never pretend not to know what the looking away cost. There is a difference between those two things. Here is what is easy to miss if you follow the story from the outside. The same tools that made Rosemary's disappearance possible, Kennedy money, Kennedy access, Kennedy control over the information people received, were now being redirected. The name that had once been used to manage a daughter's absence was now being used to put the cause in front of a president, to attach political weight to a federal commission, to attract press coverage to a summer camp that would otherwise have received none. The access that had helped build a wall was now being used to open one. That does not erase what happened to Rosemary. It does not excuse the silence that lasted 2 decades and counting. It does not answer for the father who made a decision that was not his to make. It does not restore anything to the woman living in Jefferson, Wisconsin, who would never choose her own address. But it shows something true about how families, even powerful ones, especially powerful ones, can carry damage in 2 directions at once, toward concealment and toward action, guilt and ambition wound together so tightly they are almost impossible to separate. Eunice was not a saint repairing a family sin. She was a person using everything available to her to address something she understood at a bone-deep level. The motivation was tangled. So was the result. Both things were real. By 1968, the summer camp on Eunice's Maryland lawn had become something else entirely. On July 20th, 1968, in Soldier Field in Chicago, the first International Special Olympics Games were held. About 1,000 athletes with intellectual disabilities from 26 U.S. states and beyond came to compete. They ran, swam, competed, and stepped into public view in a way many Americans had never seen before. They won ribbons. They stood on podiums. Eunice Kennedy Shriver was there. Think about what was sitting in that stadium that day. Invisible, but present. 20 years earlier, the medical and legal architecture of American society had positioned people with intellectual disabilities as problems to be managed, hidden, institutionalized, or quietly removed from public view. The categories used to describe them had been borrowed from eugenics. The institutions built to contain them were, in many places, closer to warehouses than homes. And now here were 1,000 of them, in a stadium, competing in front of crowds, not performing for pity, not being displayed as charity, competing, being scored, being applauded, not the soft, condescending applause of a benefit dinner, but the real applause of a crowd that had just watched something that took effort and heart. Parents sat in the bleachers and watched their children run. Something was shifting, slowly, incompletely, but it was real. And meanwhile, in Jefferson, Wisconsin, Rosemary Kennedy was still living her life. She was 50 years old in 1968. She had been at St. Coletta for almost 20 years. The sisters who cared for her were still there. By accounts that biographers have gathered, Rosemary was not suffering in the acute sense. She had routine, attention, and care. But care and being known are not the same thing. But she was not in Chicago. She was not watching athletes cross finish lines and receive ribbons. She was not in a stadium being applauded. She was not even in a room where most of America knew she existed. The movement growing in her sister's name, the camps, the federal attention, the stadium in Chicago, was built partly from the memory of who Rosemary had been. But that movement was not returning anything to Rosemary herself. The life the operation had taken was not given back. The years were not reclaimed. The letters she had stopped being able to write stayed unwritten. The world was slowly learning to see people like Rosemary. Rosemary had not been part of making it learn. That is the truth the chapter has to hold, even as it records something genuinely meaningful being built. A door opening for thousands of children does not unclose the door that was shut on one woman in 1941. Both facts exist. They exist at the same time. The movement was real. The cost was real. Neither one cancels the other. By the end of the 1960s, the Kennedy family's public mission around intellectual disability was becoming impossible to ignore. Federal attention had shifted. The president's panel had made intellectual disability a national issue. The Kennedy Foundation was funding research and programs. And by 1968, the movement had a name, a stadium, and a public stage. Eunice Shriver was becoming one of the most consequential advocates in American history for people the country had spent generations pretending were not fully there. And yet, the specific truth about what had happened to Rosemary Kennedy had still not reached the American public. Most people who knew the Kennedy name in 1968 still believed Rosemary had been ill, quietly incapacitated, a family tragedy vaguely understood. The word lobotomy had not been attached publicly to her name in any meaningful way. The decision Joseph Kennedy made in November 1941, the specific mechanics of it, the lack of consent, the father's authority over the daughter's mind, none of that had been opened for public examination. Eunice had opened a door for thousands of children, the door to Rosemary's own story. What was done to her, by whom and why, was still only half open. But the first crack in that door did not come from a political opponent or a hostile investigation. It came from inside the family. For years, America knew Rosemary Kennedy as an absence. Then the absence began to speak, not loudly, not all at once, not in the way of confessions or press conferences or families finally confronting what they had done. It happened the way powerful families have always released difficult truths, slowly, in fragments, in language soft enough that the full weight of it could not quite land. The country had been given a version of Rosemary for decades. She was not well, she needed care. It was a private matter. That version was not technically false, but it was built with the same precision you use when you choose which pages to include and which ones to quietly remove before you hand someone the book. And for a very long time, it held. The public story of Rosemary Kennedy did not break open dramatically. There was no single explosive moment, no one document, no one hearing, no one public confession that forced the whole story open at once. What happened was quieter and in some ways more telling. In 1962, Eunice Kennedy Shriver published an article in the Saturday Evening Post. The title was direct, "Hope for Retarded Children." It was one of the first times a member of the Kennedy family had written publicly about intellectual disability and about Rosemary in explicit, named terms. Eunice wrote about her sister. She did not name the lobotomy. She did not describe what had been done in 1941, or by whom, or under whose authority. But she wrote that Rosemary was intellectually disabled. She wrote that this reality had shaped her own commitment to the cause. She used her family's name and her sister's existence as a public argument for why America needed to treat people with intellectual disabilities differently. It was a significant moment, and it was also a carefully bounded one. What Eunice gave the public in 1962 was a sister with a disability. What the public still did not have was the decision. Both things were true, only one of them was in the article. The Kennedy family did not announce what had been done to Rosemary. It did something more effective. It announced what it was choosing to do for others like her. That gave the public a story of compassion before it had been given the full story of harm. It gave people a version they could tolerate, one that produced sympathy, maybe even admiration, without producing the kind of discomfort that demands accountability. Illness is a word that asks for compassion. Operation is a word that asks for explanation. Disability sounds like something that arrived in the world on its own, like weather. Lobotomy sounds like something someone did. The Kennedy family, across from the early 1960s, gave America the first kind of story. Rosemary had been born with difficulties. She required care. She was living quietly and being looked after. The family loved her. And now that love had grown into a public movement for people like her. That version was not nothing. It restored Rosemary's name to some version of public conversation. It acknowledged that she existed, that she mattered, that her life had meaning beyond what a family photograph included or excluded. But it was a story with a missing word, and the missing word changed everything. In 1974, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy published her autobiography, Times to Remember. She was 83 years old. She had outlived 3 of her children, Joseph Jr., Jack, Bobby, and buried more grief than most human beings are built to carry. The book is not a light document. It is a mother trying to account for her life, in her own words, on her own terms, before her time ran out. She wrote about Rosemary. What she wrote was careful. The restraint in those passages has frustrated and fascinated every biographer who has read them since. Rose described Rosemary's childhood difficulties. She described the family's efforts to find the right schools, the right structure, the right environment. She described Rosemary as a beloved daughter, always loved, never abandoned. She did not give the full account of the operation. She did not describe the morning it happened, or the room it happened in, or the fact that she had not been told in advance. She did not write in any plain way about what a prefrontal lobotomy was, what it had done to her daughter, or what it meant that a father had authorized it alone. Rose was not lying, exactly. She was doing something more humane than lying. She was writing the version of her daughter's story that she could live inside. Think about what she was carrying. She had been excluded from the decision. She had been the one who organized Rosemary's schooling, who wrote to the nuns, who managed the year-by-year effort to give her daughter the best possible life. And then the most consequential thing that ever happened to Rosemary happened without her in the room. Without any clear public record that her judgment had mattered. Without anyone leaving behind evidence that her voice changed the decision. Rose Kennedy's restraint in Times to Remember is not simply the restraint of a powerful family managing its image. It is also the restraint of a mother trying to account for something that had happened to her daughter without her being brought into the room where it was decided. She gave America a sorrow it could understand. She could not bring herself to hand it the full shape of what had occurred, and the result is a memoir that sits, even now, as an incomplete document, honest about love, silent about the machinery of what produced the loss. Here is where the story turns. By the mid-1970s, the Kennedy family had acknowledged Rosemary's intellectual disability publicly. The Special Olympics had made Eunice internationally recognized. Federal policy had begun shifting. The president's panel had helped push intellectual disability into national politics, and the cause now had a public language it had never had before. America was slowly building a public language for people it had spent generations hiding. Academic and journalistic interest in the Kennedy family had intensified enormously after the assassinations of Jack and Bobby, and yet, the word lobotomy had still not entered the mainstream public story of Rosemary Kennedy in any meaningful way. Think about why that matters. If you believed Rosemary Kennedy had been born with intellectual disability and lived quietly in Wisconsin because her family arranged good care, that is a story about fate, love, and family loyalty. It is complicated, maybe, by the decades of silence. But it does not require anyone to answer for a specific act. If you understood that Rosemary Kennedy had a frontal lobotomy performed on her in 1941 while she was awake at the instruction of her father, without her mother's knowledge and without any documented account of her own consent, that is a different story entirely. The first story has a subject, Rosemary. The second story has a subject, a decision, a doctor, a father, and a question of authority. That is not a subtle distinction. Disability is a condition. A lobotomy is an act. And an act has an actor. The public could grieve a Kennedy daughter born with difficulties. What it had not yet been asked to consider was who had decided what would happen to her mind. The fuller account of Rosemary's lobotomy did not emerge from a family statement. It entered mainstream public understanding most clearly in 1987, when Doris Kearns Goodwin's documented history placed the operation, the father's decision, and the consequences into the Kennedy story in a way the public could no longer ignore. Doris Kearns Goodwin's The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, published in 1987, included material on Rosemary that gave readers a more complete picture of what had happened, including the lobotomy and its consequences, drawing on interviews and historical records that forced the subject into sharper focus. Goodwin's 1987 account is often cited as a significant moment when the public story of Rosemary Kennedy began to shift. Not because it was the first time the word appeared anywhere, but because a serious, widely read, documented history placed it in context. The operation, the year, the doctors, the father's decision, the outcome, assembled in one place for a general audience, in a work that could not be easily dismissed. The family did not issue a formal response. There was no press conference, no official correction of the record. The shift was not managed. It just happened. The way things happen when a story becomes too well documented to stay inside a controlled version. And something changed in the public conversation about Rosemary when it did. The surviving letters in the Kennedy Library archives, the ones Rosemary wrote from her schools in the 1930s, halting and misspelled, but entirely her own, had been in the historical record all along. By the time those letters entered serious public and academic discussion, Rosemary herself was in her late 60s and 70s. She had not written a letter in decades. Not the kind she had written from Devereux, or from London, or from Washington. The voice those letters carried, effortful, warm, specifically hers, was gone in the sense that counted, not dead, just unreachable, in a way that the original operation had made permanent. The letters survived. They outlasted everything that had been done to the hands that wrote them. And when researchers and biographers began using them to reconstruct who Rosemary had actually been before 1941, the contrast they created between the woman in those pages and the diagnosis that had been used to erase her became one of the most morally precise things in the entire story. Her handwriting was still there. Her voice was still in those pages, even if it could no longer reach anyone in the same way. The letters did not accuse anyone. They did not need to. By the time the fuller story of Rosemary's lobotomy was part of the mainstream public record, roughly the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Rosemary Kennedy was in her 70s. She had been living at St. Coletta for more than 40 years. The truth arriving did not give her those years back. It did not restore her speech. It did not return her ability to write. It did not put her on a stage in Chicago in 1968, or in a photograph from Jack's inauguration in 1961, or at a dinner table in Hyannisport for any of the years between. It changed the public record. It changed how historians and journalists, and eventually the broader public, understood who was responsible for what had happened to her. But the years themselves were not in the public record to change. There is a particular cruelty to delayed truth that is easy to miss if you focus only on the moment of exposure. We tend to experience the revelation as arrival. Now we know, now it is finally in the open, and that feeling of arrival can make the revelation feel like a kind of justice. It is not justice. It is just accuracy arriving late. Justice would have required the truth to arrive in time to matter differently for Rosemary herself. In time to ask questions about her care. In time to center her preferences, her comfort, her remaining life in a conversation that included her name. The truth arrived when it arrived, and she was already decades gone from everything that truth, spoken earlier, might have changed. There is a question that sits underneath the entire arc of how this story reached the public. When a family begins releasing a difficult truth in careful increments, disability first, then privacy, then a mention in a memoir, then a biography, then another biography, until the word lobotomy is finally unavoidable. Who is that process serving? It is serving the family's ability to control the terms of its own exposure. That is not necessarily cynical. People do not typically announce their most painful failures all at once. Families hold things. They release them when they can, when the language is ready, when enough time has passed that the sharpest edges have softened. That is human. But it is also true that the incremental release of a truth does something particular when the person at the center of that truth is still alive and still affected. It produces a public conversation about her, about what was done to her, that she is not part of. Her name returns to print. Her story becomes part of a national conversation about disability, advocacy, medical ethics, and the price of family ambition. And she is in Jefferson, Wisconsin, still. The conversation is happening about her, not with her, not around her in any way that reaches inside what her days actually feel like. Powerful families have always had a talent for making a story their own, even when the story belongs to someone else. The Kennedy family gave America a version of Rosemary that fit first into a narrative of private tragedy, then into a narrative of advocacy and redemption, and finally, reluctantly, under the pressure of documented history, into a narrative of medical harm and accountability. Each version was partial. Each version came on the family's timeline, not Rosemary's. Once the word lobotomy was attached to Rosemary Kennedy's name in the public record, once the act had a name, and the name had an actor, and the actor had a motive, the question the story asked changed. It was no longer, where did Rosemary go? The family had managed that question for decades. They had answered it in soft, incomplete terms that the public had largely accepted. The new question was harder. It was the kind of question that does not dissolve when a family releases a formal statement, or funds a research center, or builds a stadium. Who sent her there? And beneath that, who allowed it? Who stayed quiet? Who built a movement in her name while the full story of what happened to her stayed mostly out of public view? And what does it mean that the woman who lived through it was not the one who got to decide when the world would finally know? Those questions did not arrive as a verdict. They arrived as a discomfort that settled into the historical record and stayed. The Kennedys had spent decades deciding what America was allowed to know about Rosemary. Once the word lobotomy entered the story, the terms of that control were gone. But the woman in Wisconsin was still there, and some members of the family had started doing something they had not done for years. They had started visiting. What they found when they arrived, and what Rosemary's last decades looked like when her family finally came back into them, is what Chapter 6 is about. The family did not come back all at once. That would be too simple a story, and nothing about Rosemary Kennedy's life was ever simple. There was no reunion scene, no single morning when a car pulled up to St. Coletta and everyone climbed out together and some long-held wound was addressed with the gravity it deserved. Powerful families are not built for that kind of reckoning. They are built for forward motion, for managing what is visible, scheduling what can be scheduled, and keeping the machinery running even when the machinery has done terrible things. So, the return was not a moment. It was a series of smaller things: cars on Wisconsin roads, sisters making phone calls, a mother getting older, a father losing the one thing he had always used to control everything else. In December 1961, Joseph Kennedy Sr. suffered a massive stroke. He was 73 years old. He was at his Palm Beach estate. He had spent the year watching his son be inaugurated President of the United States. The achievement he had spent his entire adult life engineering, through money, ambition, and the sacrifices of everyone around him, including one daughter who never got to attend the inauguration. The stroke damaged his body and his speech. Sit with that reversal for a second. The man who had authorized a surgery, partly because he feared what Rosemary might become in public. The man who had controlled letters, explanations, decisions, and family information for decades, suddenly found his own voice severely limited. He lived for almost 8 more years. His speech improved somewhat, but it was never again the instrument of command it had been. Joseph Kennedy Sr. died in November 1969, after years in which the family had to learn what power looked like when the man who once held it could no longer speak the way he once had. Public accounts do not show Joseph Kennedy Sr. returning to Rosemary at St. Coletta. The father who authorized the operation did not become a visible presence in the institution where its consequences were lived. What can be said is this: the silence he had maintained around Rosemary was his to maintain for as long as he had the authority to maintain it. After December 1961, that authority was largely gone. He could not write the letters he had once written to teachers and caretakers. He could not control the flow of information the way he had always controlled it. He could not decide who knew what. After Joseph Kennedy's power over the family's choices weakened, some of the silence around Rosemary became easier to disturb. It did not dissolve overnight. But the wall had a different keeper now. In the years after Joseph's authority weakened, and especially after his death, the family's contact with Rosemary began to change. Biographers, including Kate Clifford Larson, describe Rose's relationship with Rosemary in later years as one of genuine, if complicated, maternal presence. Rose was by then navigating her own grief. 3 sons dead violently, a marriage that had required her to absorb betrayal after betrayal, a public life built entirely on composure. She was not a woman who expressed things easily. After the long separation, Rose did come to Wisconsin. She sat with Rosemary. She brought things, photographs, familiar objects, the kind of small physical evidence that a family still exists outside the walls of an institution. Whether those visits reached Rosemary in the way a mother hopes, the way a mother needs to believe they do, that is not something the surviving record can say with certainty. What the record suggests is that Rosemary responded to people she knew, that she was not unreachable, that familiar voices and faces produced reactions that the sisters at St. Coletta recognized as recognition. She was not simply waiting, she was still there, in the ways that mattered. Eunice visited. This is well documented. Of all the siblings, Eunice had carried Rosemary closest through the years. Not because she said the most about her publicly, but because she had built an entire movement from the specific weight of what had been taken. She knew what she was visiting. She knew the distance between the sister she remembered and the woman in the cottage in Jefferson, Wisconsin. She came anyway. By accounts that biographers have gathered from people close to the Shriver family and to St. Coletta, Eunice was a consistent presence in Rosemary's later life. She did not come to manage. She did not come to apologize on behalf of a family, or to perform the kind of attentive visits that produce good press. She came in the way a sister comes, quietly, with the kind of regularity that signals intention rather than obligation. Jean Kennedy Smith also visited in later years, as did other family members. though the timing and frequency varied and are not uniformly documented across sources. The family did not return as one body. It returned in pieces, in different years, at different intervals, with different levels of consistency and presence. She had once been visible to the world. Now family members crossed Wisconsin to reach the woman the world had been taught not to see. Think about what that reversal means. The family had spent 2 decades arranging for the world not to see her. Now they were arranging to see her themselves, traveling to the Midwestern institution they had placed her in, entering the same building they had once used as a solution, sitting in the same rooms they had once considered sufficient. The geography of the return is not a small thing. Jefferson, Wisconsin is not a place you visit accidentally. It is not on the way to anywhere in the Kennedy family's orbit. You drive there because you have decided to drive there. Every visit required intention. Every visit required someone to say, "She is there, and I am going." For years that trip had not been made, or had been made rarely, or had been made in the kind of muted, infrequent way that honors a duty rather than a relationship. That changed in the later decades in ways the record can describe without inventing. What did a visit actually look like? The record is careful here, and so should any account of it be. Rosemary lived in a small cottage on the St. Coletta grounds. She had her own space, not a ward, not a shared room in a facility that smelled of institutional cleaning products and the specific sadness of large, underfunded systems. She had a cottage. She had sisters who knew her name and her habits and her preferences. Sisters who had been with her for years. Biographers describe her as someone who responded to music, who enjoyed walks on the grounds, the physical rhythm of movement that her body could still manage in some form, even after the partial paralysis the operation had caused to her right side. Who attended chapel, who had the kind of day shaped by familiar ritual, which is its own form of comfort when so much else has been stripped away. She could not hold a sustained conversation. She could not write the letters she had once written. But she was not a person reduced to only absence and silence. She was a person who had preferences, who knew faces, who had a daily texture to her life that included care, movement, chapel, the changing of seasons in Wisconsin, and eventually the presence of family members who had once been very far away. When a family member arrived at that cottage, there was a hallway to walk down. There were the sounds of an institution, quiet, structured, the particular sound of a place built for people who require consistency. There was a door, and on the other side of it was Rosemary. Not the Rosemary from the letters in the Kennedy Library archives. Not the woman who had once written home in her own careful, uneven handwriting. The woman in the cottage in Jefferson, Wisconsin, was not that person in the same way she had been that person before November 1941. But she was still a person, and she was still there. The hand that once wrote letters was now being held instead. That line does not need invented dialogue around it. Physical presence is enough, sitting beside her, a hand held, a familiar name spoken, the presence of a body in a room, carrying all the history of a family, sitting quietly next to a woman who had lived 60-something years since the morning everything changed. What does a Kennedy sibling say in that room? The record does not tell us, because no one recorded it, or because what was said was private enough that it stayed private. And that privacy, unlike the earlier privacy that had been used to manage an image, feels like something that belongs to the people in the room. Some silences are protective. Some silences are a wall. The earlier silence was a wall. The silence inside a cottage in Wisconsin between two sisters sitting together is something else. Late love is still love, but it is not justice. There is a distinction that is easy to collapse, particularly in a story that wants a redemption arc, that wants to give the audience relief, that wants to let the family back into a decent light. The visits were real. The care was real. The presence of family members in Rosemary's later life, however inconsistent, however complicated by everything that preceded it, was real, and none of it gave back the years. Rosemary Kennedy was at St. Coletta from 1949 until her death in 2005. 56 years. A woman who had been 23 years old when the operation was performed lived inside the consequences of that operation until she was 86. The arithmetic of that is its own kind of statement. A visit can fill a room. It cannot refill a decade. What the family could offer in those later years was presence, regularity. The specific message that a visit sends, that someone has decided you are worth the drive, that has meaning, that is not nothing. People who study what matters to individuals with significant cognitive impairment after brain injury consistently note that familiar human presence, consistency of contact, the experience of being known rather than just managed, these things register. They are real forms of care. What the family could not offer was repair. You cannot restore what was severed. You cannot return what was removed. You cannot give back a woman the decades in which her siblings married, had children, buried brothers, gave speeches, opened stadiums, and became myths, while she walked in circles on a cottage lawn in Wisconsin, and the seasons changed without her participation in any of the things that were growing in her name. Forgiveness is too clean a word for what happened here. So is resentment. The record gives us no evidence that Rosemary experienced what she had been through in the moral and legal terms that the story demands. She was not able to prosecute a grievance in the way a cognitively intact adult might. Whether she remembered the life she had before, whether she felt the gap between who she had been and who she was, whether she experienced something that could be called grief for what had been taken. These are questions the surviving record does not answer, and they should not be answered by imagination. What can be said is that she was a human being who had been through something irreversible, who was cared for in her later decades by dedicated sisters and by family members who came, and that the distance between the care she received and the justice her situation deserved was never fully closed. The family's reckoning in those later decades did not look like a single event. Some of it looked like Eunice, building something so large that it could not be fully separated from the sister it was built around, even when the sister's name was not always at the front of the stage. Some of it looked like Rose, an aging mother who had survived more public grief than almost any American woman of her generation, coming to sit in a Wisconsin cottage and be present in the only way still available to her. Some of it may have looked like guilt. Biographers describe, carefully, that some Kennedy family members carried the weight of what had happened to Rosemary in ways that were never fully resolved, that the specific knowledge of what Joseph had authorized, and when other siblings learned the full shape of it, and how that knowledge sat alongside the family mythology they had spent their lives maintaining, was not simple to live inside. But the record does not give us confessions. It does not give us private letters in which a Kennedy sibling sits down and writes out the full moral weight of what they understood had been done. What we have are actions, visits, advocacy, the specific shape of what Eunice built, and what those actions suggest without claiming certainty about what they felt. The record says the family came back. It does not say they came back whole. By the 1990s, Rosemary Kennedy was in her 70s. She had been at St. Coletta for more than 4 decades. The sisters who had first received her in 1949 were gone, replaced by newer generations of caregivers who knew her not as the famous Kennedy daughter who had arrived young, but as a woman who belonged to the institution the way long-term residents belong, her routines familiar, her preferences known, her presence a given. Larson's biography describes Rosemary in her later decades as someone who had found a kind of stability. Not the stability of a recovered life, not the stability of a woman who had been restored to the person she had been in 1940, dancing at a London theater, or writing letters from Pennsylvania in her careful, effortful hand. The stability of a life that had settled into its particular shape after the irreversible thing had happened. She had routines. She took walks. She could be taken for rides. A dog could walk beside her. There were caregivers who knew her habits, her limits, and the small signs of recognition that mattered. She had relearned how to walk, but with a limp. She never regained clear speech, and one arm remained affected. There is a photograph from her later years, not widely reproduced, not part of the official Kennedy image archive, in which she is sitting outside. She looks like herself. She looks like the woman who is still recognizably connected to the person in the earlier photographs, the dark-haired woman in the early photographs, smiling, present, leaning into her mother in Cape Cod sunlight. She is older, she is different, but she is not gone. The family photograph had spent decades with a missing edge. In her later years, the family learned, slowly and incompletely, to include that edge again, to show up in the room, to sit in the cottage, to carry her name into conversations where it had been absent for too long. It was not the same as giving the photograph back the years it had excluded, but it was something. On January 7, 2005, Rosemary Kennedy died at Fort Atkinson Memorial Hospital in Wisconsin. She was 86 years old. She had lived for 63 years after the operation. For more than half a century, she had occupied a world that mostly did not know she existed, while her family's name became one of the most famous in American history, while her sister built a movement in the image of everything she had lost, while the country slowly and incompletely learned to see people like her. The statement from the Kennedy family described her as a beloved daughter and sister. The news coverage noted her disability, her life at St. Coletta, her connection to the Special Olympics founding story. Some outlets mentioned the lobotomy, some did not. She was buried in the Kennedy family plot at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts, the same Massachusetts town where she had been born on September 13, 1918, in a bedroom where a doctor was late and a nurse made a decision and a brain was changed before the world had any idea who it was changing. She came home at the end. She had not been home, in any continuous sense, for most of her adult life. What do we do with that? Not with the family's record, not with Joseph Kennedy's decision, not with the medical system that made the operation possible. Those questions have been answered as fully as the record allows. What do we do with Rosemary herself? Not as a symbol of what was done to her, not as the origin story of a movement, not as the Kennedy family's wound, but as a person who lived for 86 years and deserved to be known as more than the thing that happened to her? That is the question the story has been building toward. America finally knows what was done to her. The word is in the record. The actor has been named. The consent that was never asked for has been noted in every serious account of her life. The movement built in her image has changed millions of lives. The family came back in the imperfect and human ways that families come back, and she was not entirely alone in those final decades. But knowing what happened to Rosemary Kennedy is not the same as knowing who she was. She was a person before any of this. She had warmth. She had effort. She had a voice that showed up in letters, and in the way she leaned into her mother in photographs, and in the curtsy she practiced until it was good enough to survive a British palace. She was not only what was done to her. Most people never got to ask Rosemary Kennedy a single question. The archive gave us the next best thing, her own handwriting. Still waiting. Most people meet Rosemary Kennedy at the worst moment of her life. They arrive through a headline, through a documentary clip, through a sentence in a book about the Kennedy family that says, almost in passing, that there was a sister and something was done to her and she was hidden away. The lobotomy catches them. The father's permission stops them cold. The silence of 20+ years shocks them into attention. And then, because human beings need a shape for grief, they reach for the easiest shape available. They remember her as a tragedy. That is understandable. It is also not enough, because a tragedy is something that happens to a person. And Rosemary Kennedy was not only something that happened to, she was someone there is a specific kind of harm that history does to people who could not write their own ending. A name becomes a diagnosis. A photograph becomes evidence. A full human life, with its mornings and preferences and stubbornnesses and small joys, collapses down into the single worst thing that was done to it. And once the reduction sets in, it becomes the story, not the person. The story about the person. And stories, especially famous ones, are very hard to peel back from the human beings they are supposed to be honoring. This is not unique to Rosemary Kennedy. It happens to anyone whose life is narrated almost entirely by other people, by a powerful father, by a family's public relations instinct, by a grieving sister's advocacy, by a biographer who arrives 40 years later with a box of incomplete files. The narrative fills in, the gaps get plastered over, and what gets lost, quietly, persistently, is the person who was living through it before anyone was narrating it. What we owe Rosemary Kennedy, not as a symbol of disability rights, not as a chapter in a political dynasty, not as a medical ethics cautionary tale, is the harder, slower work of seeing her whole. So let's try. Not the Rosemary who walked into that Washington hospital in November 1941. Not the Rosemary of the Wisconsin years. But the Rosemary who existed before the story took her, and the parts of her that the story could not fully reach even after. The letters in the archives at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library are not dramatic. They never will be. They are written in a hand that worked hard for every word. Uneven letters, inconsistent spelling, sentences that stop before they're finished and then pick themselves back up. They say ordinary things, that she is well, that she misses her family, that she learns something new, that she loves them. Those letters survived her. Sit with that for a second. Think about what it means that a piece of paper held in a folder in a climate-controlled room in Boston carries the handwriting of a woman whose story was controlled for decades by people who did not want the world to look too closely at her. The paper did not obey that instruction. The paper stayed. Her hand is still on it. The pressure of the pen, the shape of the letters she formed slowly and deliberately. The evidence that she had a voice and used it in the way available to her for as long as she could. That is not a tragedy. That is a person. Here is the thing about the Kennedy myth that made Rosemary so difficult for it to hold. The Kennedy story, the one the family built, the one the press amplified, the one Americans absorbed through decades of photographs and assassinations and eulogies, was a story about a certain kind of greatness. It was a story built for sons who ran for office and daughters who married well, for heroic deaths and graceful public grief, for beauty that held up under pressure and ambition that bent toward public service. The Kennedys were a family of directed, legible, photographable achievement. Rosemary's life asked for something that story had no category for. Not achievement, care, not direction, patience, not ambition, accommodation. She needed the people around her to slow down, to adapt, to measure success differently, to build a life that was shaped around her, rather than requiring her to be shaped around it. And a family running that hard, toward that much, with that much to prove, that family did not know how to do that. It was not equipped for it. The myth it was building had no grammar for dependency, no vocabulary for the kind of love that does not produce a result. The Kennedy story knew exactly what to do with sons who died young. Monuments, libraries, eternal flames. It knew how to turn grief into grandeur. It did not know what to do with a daughter who simply needed more time. What did Rosemary's life look like after the operation changed it? This matters, and it matters specifically because the public story has a way of treating the post-lobotomy years as a kind of absence, as if the real Rosemary ended in 1941, and what came after was merely a body in Wisconsin outlasting the plot. That framing is not history. It is pity dressed up as remembrance. The documented record, thin as it is, tells a different story. Rosemary Kennedy spent decades at St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin, cared for primarily by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi. She had routines. She had people she recognized. She responded to the nuns who tended to her. She went to Mass. She liked to walk. She had moments of engagement with people she knew. And later in life, after Joseph's stroke weakened the old structure of control, and especially after his death, family contact gradually increased. Accounts suggest she responded to familiar voices, familiar faces, and the kind of presence that told her she was not alone. None of that is recovery. No one should call it that. The operation took things from her that did not come back, and the archive cannot tell us what it felt like to live inside that loss, or whether she had a continuous understanding of what had been taken. What the archive can say is this: she was present. She occupied space. She mattered to people who knew her daily. Her humanity was not contingent on anything. It was there. It was hers. It required nothing of her to justify it. Now, Eunice. Eunice Kennedy Shriver built something real from the pain of what happened to her sister. That is true, and it should be said plainly. The movement she helped build changed public visibility for people with intellectual disabilities in the United States, and her advocacy helped push the country toward a broader legal and cultural reckoning. The legislation that followed, the public visibility that grew, the cultural shift in how Americans were encouraged to see disability, these things mattered in the lives of millions of people. That is not performance. That is consequence. But here is what needs to be said carefully in a final chapter that wants to be honest. A movement born from pain does not make the pain acceptable. Rosemary Kennedy did not suffer so that Special Olympics could exist. She suffered because her father made a decision in 1941 that no one stopped, and because the medical culture of that era had confidence far exceeding its evidence, and because a family's fear of shame was treated as a legitimate reason to override a young woman's future. The fact that something good grew from that, genuinely, measurably, permanently good, does not redeem the harm. It does not settle the account. We do not owe Eunice less credit because of this. We owe Rosemary more honesty. The danger in the way her story has been told, the danger that even well-meaning tellings can fall into, is that Rosemary becomes the origin wound in someone else's hero narrative. She becomes the reason Eunice mattered. She becomes, as one writer put it, the sister who taught the family. As if her role was pedagogical, as if her suffering was useful. She was not a lesson. She was a sister, a daughter, a woman who had her own relationship to her life, her own small daily victories, her own losses that did not require meaning to be real. There are questions this story leaves behind that do not have clean answers. That is not a failure of research. It is the honest shape of the historical record. What do powerful families owe the people they remove from view? The Kennedy family gave Rosemary care, genuine, funded, professional care for the rest of her long life. But care and justice are not synonyms. Care can be arranged from a distance. Justice requires acknowledgement, accountability, the willingness to say plainly what was done and why it was wrong. The historical record does not show that acknowledgement arriving in full, in public, from the family as an institution. What does medicine owe the patients it harmed with procedures it was not sure enough to be performing? Walter Freeman performed thousands of lobotomies across his career. In 1967, after a longtime patient died following a third lobotomy, his surgical access effectively ended. He died in 1972, still believing, according to accounts of his later years, that his work had helped more than it hurt. That belief is part of the record, too. The harm he did was real. His certainty never wavered. Those two things lived inside the same career. And what does history owe someone who could not speak back? That question is the whole of this chapter. It is the only question that matters now. The answer is not a monument. Monuments are for the family's comfort. The answer is not inspiration. Inspiration turns people into mirrors for other people's feelings. The answer is something quieter, and it requires something from the person encountering the story. It requires refusing the reduction. It means not stopping at the lobotomy, not using the lobotomy as the whole of her meaning, not making the worst thing done to her the loudest thing remembered about her. It means going back to the letters. Going back to the young woman who held herself together under pressure that would have broken plenty of people who were never called broken. Going back to the woman in Wisconsin who knew her sister's voice after decades and reached for the hand that reached for hers. It means choosing to see the whole life, not the headline version, not the advocacy origin version, not the medical ethics cautionary tale version, but the actual one, partial, documented in fragments, filtered through other people's accounts, but still traceable, still human, still hers. In early family photographs from those years, the Kennedy children are lined up in the way families line up for photographs. A little impatient, a little posed, everyone leaning slightly toward whoever is looking most charming. Rosemary is in the frame. She is smiling. What that photograph cannot show, and what the Kennedy family would later edit out of its public story, is what it took for her to be there. The practicing, the patience of the nuns who worked with her, the effort she put into every ordinary thing that the people beside her did without thinking. She stands in the frame like everyone else stands in the frame, which is the point. She is one of them, and she is trying, and she is present, and she is smiling. The myth later learned to crop that image, to print the Kennedy story without the edge that held her. But the original photograph includes her. She is right there. She always was. There is one more thing to say, and it needs to be said without flourishing. The Kennedy story is one of the most told stories in American history. It has been told by journalists and biographers and filmmakers and politicians and the Kennedy family itself across 80 years of constant narration. It has its villains and its martyrs, its assassinations and its tragedies, its myths and its corrections. It has been celebrated and interrogated, worshipped and dismantled, put on pedestals and knocked off them. And through all of it, for most of that time, one person was left at its edge. Not because she was unimportant, because she was too important to the story the family needed to be telling. Because her life, her real life, her full life, the life before and after and through everything that was done to her, asked questions the myth could not answer. Questions about what a family owes its most vulnerable member, about what ambition costs when it is paid for by someone who did not agree to pay, about what it means to love people conditionally, and what happens when the condition is met with someone who simply cannot satisfy it. Rosemary Kennedy was not the secret at the edge of the Kennedy story. She was the daughter at its center, not because of what was done to her, because of what her life reveals, about power, about care, about the cost of shame, about what happens when a family decides that one human being is too inconvenient to be fully seen. And before she was a secret, before she was a chapter, a scandal, a cautionary tale, a footnote, a movement, a symbol, a wound, she was a girl, writing slow, careful letters home, walking into a room full of strangers in white gloves, heart probably pounding, doing her level best. That girl was real. She was always real. History cannot give Rosemary Kennedy her life back, but it can stop taking her name away.